He left me 8 months ago, thinking I'd never return. But tonight, I walked in with something he never expected. Stay with me till the end to see what happens when a mafia boss meets the daughter he never knew existed. The choices, the betrayals, and the Christmas that rewrote everything. Welcome back to Heartwoven Tales. I'm Selena. I hope you're doing well. I'd love to know, where are you listening to me from today? Make sure you stay with me till the very end, because this story is full of twists, emotions, and surprises you won't want to miss. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now, let's dive in. Brix Moretti did not celebrate Christmas in the way ordinary people did. To him, holidays were opportunities, tools, and battlegrounds. He designed the mansion to resemble perfection, but not warmth. Every light was deliberate, every candle placed to cast the shadows he wanted rather than chase them away. The towering tree in the main hall was decorated not with nostalgia, but with symbols of control. Shimmering ornaments reflected not just light, but power. Guests wandering through the halls were subtly reminded of hierarchy. Every glance calibrated, every smile measured. It was elegance, yes, but cold elegance. Laughter flowed through the rooms like clockwork. The echoes of joy, controlled and contained, rehearsed to serve his narrative. Brix did not believe in spontaneous cheer. Chaos had no place in a house under his rule. 8 months earlier, Brix had walked away from Jenni without hesitation. No excuses, no emotional baggage left to clutter his path. Her love, once radiant and consuming, had become inconvenient, a distraction that threatened his empire more than it had fueled it. He had chosen ambition over intimacy, dominance over affection, and control over vulnerability. Every night since had been a lesson in discipline, every decision a reminder that love, if unguarded, was a weapon turned against the wielder. The invitation she had received that December afternoon was a calculated act. Polite, almost indifferent, it had carried the weight of a challenge, an unspoken question that hovered in the air. See what I've become, and understand that the past is gone. Selena stood beside him, like the final punctuation on a sentence no one dared to interrupt. She was flawless, a human sculpture of poise and precision. Her hand rested possessively on his arm, and her eyes sparkled with a satisfaction that came from understanding the true reach of influence. "She'll understand tonight," she whispered softly, almost conspiratorially, and the words carried an edge sharp enough to cut glass. There was no malice in them. There was certainty. She didn't need to threaten. Her confidence alone was enough to unsettle anyone who had once shared history with him. Brix allowed himself the smallest smirk, trusting that her interpretation aligned perfectly with his own. He was ready. He believed he was untouchable. Guests mingled, glasses clinking, voices rising and falling in patterns that mimicked the perfect rhythm of a well-conducted orchestra. Every laugh and compliment had been anticipated, every comment pre-scripted in his mind, a subtle reaffirmation of dominance. Brix walked through the crowd, hands in pockets, eyes scanning, posture impeccable. His presence was commanding, and he knew it. Women looked up and men looked away. Respect, fear, desire. They were all accounted for in the meticulous construction of the evening. Yet in the back of his mind, a shadow lingered. He told himself it was anxiety over minor details, the chef, the music, the timing. But deep down, he knew better. Somewhere, lurking beyond the polished perfection, was the uncertainty that had once held him captive. The clock ticked, slow but unforgiving. A soft breeze whispered against the mansion's doors, unnoticed by the guests caught in polite conversation. Brix didn't hear it either, not yet, but something in the air shifted. The music faltered imperceptibly, as if the house itself paused in anticipation. Then, without warning, the doors swung open, letting in a flood of cold air that immediately cut through the controlled warmth of the hall. Conversation halted mid-sentence. Laughter froze. Glasses paused mid-raise. Everyone turned, and in that moment time contracted, focusing on the one movement that would unravel the evening, the entrance of Jenni. She stepped inside with a grace that was almost ritualistic, calm, radiant, unshakable. Her presence carried a weight that no announcement, no pretense of control could diminish. She moved as though the mansion, the people, and even Brick's carefully constructed dominance were irrelevant. Her eyes scanned the room, catching glimpses of the guests before settling on him. No fear, no hesitation, only certainty. Bricks felt a flicker of something he hadn't anticipated, a recognition that he had miscalculated. She wasn't the vulnerable, heartbroken figure he had imagined. She was untouchable. Every calculated move, every orchestration of the night suddenly seemed fragile. Then, the focus sharpened. Cradled in her arms was a newborn baby boy, swaddled in white fabric that glowed under the chandelier lights. The child's presence sucked the air from the room, a gravitational pull that rendered casual observation impossible. The murmurs started softly, tentative, but never fully formed into words. Selena's hand stiffened, her grip on Brick's arm tightening in surprise and calculation. This wasn't in the plan. This was exposure. And the baby's serene, oblivious demeanor made it all the more devastating. Bricks felt a jolt in his chest, the kind of shock that bypassed thought entirely, striking at the core of instinct. The baby shifted slightly, a delicate turn of the head that sent the room into a suspended moment of recognition. Bricks saw the face, felt the impossible weight of reality press against him. The line of the jaw, the curve of the lips, features mirrored from a past he had tried to bury. His lungs burned as he realized the truth, a primal recognition that defied logic. This was his son. The implications were instantaneous, unrelenting, and terrifying. The world had changed in a heartbeat. Control had slipped through his fingers before he had even realized it. Jenni's gaze found his across the hall. No accusation, no plea, no vulnerability, only absolute clarity. She held the child securely, her eyes communicating 1,000 words without speaking a single one. Bricks felt the familiar armor of dominance crack under the force of revelation. Every calculated move of the night, every strategy he had deployed to display power, suddenly seemed meaningless. The weapon he had intended for her had been neutralized, turned back upon him, and yet he could not look away. The room, the people, the music, all faded into irrelevance. All that existed was her, the child, and the sudden, unmanageable torrent of emotion that surged inside him. Questions he had not dared to form clawed at his mind. How had she survived without him knowing? Why had she returned now, and with a child? Was it chance, fate, revenge, or something more intricate, more personal? He could not answer. He could only watch. Even as he processed, Jenni took a slow, deliberate step forward. The baby nestled against her heart. Every movement was an assertion of fact, a declaration of truth. She belonged to the world in a way he could not undo. The mansion, his control, his carefully constructed empire, it all seemed to shrink under the gravity of her presence. Bricks realized, with an uneasy mix of fear and fascination, that tonight had already escaped his command. The invitation, meant as a weapon, had exploded in his own hands. The first whisper of panic touched his mind, subtle but undeniable. His calculated composure was cracking at the edges. For the first time in months, maybe years, he did not know the next step. Every instinct that had kept him untouchable felt inadequate, and yet he could not retreat. To move now would admit weakness. To act recklessly could destroy everything. Every guest in the room waited, some aware, some blissfully ignorant, for the unfolding confrontation. Bricks felt the weight of observation, judgment, and expectation press down with an intensity he had not anticipated. Jenni's lips curved slightly, not in a smile, not in malice, but in acknowledgement of the control she now held over him simply by existing. The baby cooed softly, a sound that fractured the last layer of detachment he had maintained. Brick's vision narrowed to the child, the reflection of his own features, and the woman who had outlasted his every attempt to erase her from his life. The night was no longer his. The weapon he had designed for her had been turned, not with force, but with presence, patience, and timing he could neither predict nor counter. And in that moment, as the mansion hummed with a fragile, brittle joy, and the shadows stretched long against the polished floors, Brick's Moretti realized something vital and terrifying. Control had limits. Some consequences could not be calculated, some truths could not be managed, and some arrivals, quiet, deliberate, radiant, could undo an empire of planning with a single step. Jenni walked forward without hesitation, each step deliberate, a quiet declaration that she had survived the months he had thought erased her from his world. Her heels clicked against the polished marble floors, punctuating the silence with precision, a rhythm that mirrored Brick's tightening pulse. He could not move, could not breathe, and could not tear his gaze from the small bundle she cradled against her chest. The baby's tiny hand curled into a fist, pressing lightly against her heart, and Bricks felt a pang of recognition so sharp it cut through the armor of indifference he had spent years perfecting. "He's yours," she said, her voice low, almost fragile, but landing with the impact of steel against stone. Every syllable carried a weight he had never experienced from words alone. 8 months had passed, and yet those months were concentrated into that single moment, striking him harder than anything he had endured in business or bloodshed. Numbers, dates, the precision of elapsed time, all converged to scream the same horrifying truth. He had missed it. He had failed. Instinct drove his hand forward, an urge to reach, to hold, to reclaim what the universe had suddenly revealed as his responsibility. But fear froze him mid-motion, a physical paralysis that spread from his chest to his fingertips. He could not touch her, could not touch the child, could not undo the revelation that had shattered the meticulous order of his life. Every ounce of power he had cultivated, every empire of control, now seemed fragile, trivial, meaningless. Selena's laughter cut sharply through the tension, controlled, deliberate, perfectly timed. It was not amusement. It was weaponized, intended to deepen his humiliation, to punctuate the scene with a reminder that he had underestimated the stakes. "A lie," she said, crisp and poisonous, "meant to embarrass you in front of your guests. Surely you're not going to believe this." Her eyes gleamed with victory, and for a moment Bricks felt the world narrowing to the single axis of her smug delight. But Jenni did not argue, did not flinch, did not step back. She met Brick's gaze directly, unwavering, and in that look he recognized a strength he had once tried to own, now fully untethered. "You disappeared," she said quietly, pain slipping through the calm veneer she had maintained for months. The words were soft, but they carried the force of a gunshot. 8 months of absence, of silence, of unspoken questions and unreturned calls, boiled down into 2 simple words that branded him guilty. His chest tightened. The air seemed thicker, heavier, almost impossible to draw into his lungs. Every muscle in his body ached with the sudden realization of consequences he had thought long behind him. The baby stirred, tiny eyes flickering open for the briefest instant, revealing a gaze that mirrored his own. Bricks felt his knees weaken, though he remained standing, rooted to the spot by a mixture of awe and terror. This child, innocent and vulnerable, carried the reflection of his blood, the proof of his choices, and the undeniable evidence of failure he had never allowed himself to face. The realization struck with a violence no weapon could emulate. Jenni's eyes softened, but only slightly, enough to hint at mercy that she had not extended in the past months. She cradled the child closer, a subtle act of defiance, an unspoken claim that this life belonged to both of them, yet depended entirely on her timing, her revelation. Brick's mind raced, cataloging every possibility, every error, every misstep that had led to this exact second. 8 months of absence had left him unprepared, and yet the weight of this truth made every second of hesitation monumental. Selena moved closer, her presence a calculated barrier between him and the undeniable reality before him. She was still smiling, still confident, still weaponized in her own right, and yet her sharp edge could not pierce the shield Jenni carried effortlessly. Bricks felt a flicker of anger, not at Jenni, but at himself, at the fact that his perception of power had been so easily subverted. Every lesson in dominance he had learned, every empire built through fear, now collided with the raw, irrefutable evidence of life he had never seen coming. Guests in the room began to murmur, the low buzz of voices threading through the tension, yet none dared approach, none could intervene. The air was thick with expectation, as if the universe itself held its breath to see what Bricks Moretti would do next. He wanted to speak, to demand answers, to reassert control, but words failed him. They were inadequate against the weight of what stood before him. Jenni's gaze did not waver. "Do you even see him?" she asked quietly, almost rhetorically, as if daring him to acknowledge what he already knew in his bones. The room seemed to shrink around the three of them. Him, her, the child, everything else. Selena's judgment, the guests' curious eyes, the music, faded into insignificance. There was only the truth, laid bare, impossible to deny or manipulate. Brick's fingers twitched again, the instinct to reach out returning with an urgency that battled against the frost of fear and disbelief. His mind flashed with memories he had buried, gentle touches, whispered promises, nights of intimacy he had abandoned. And now, in the present, those memories became chains, tying him to a truth he had refused to see. The baby cooed softly, a sound that would normally inspire tenderness, yet now acted like a hammer against the walls he had built around his heart. Every second stretched unbearably. Jenni's forward movement was measured, intentional, a demonstration of control that he had never expected from the one he had left behind. She had returned on her own terms, wielding revelation as a weapon, sharper than any he could muster. Bricks felt the edges of his empire, his identity, beginning to splinter. The very foundation of his self-image, the man who calculated, the man who controlled, the man who never faltered, was cracking under the weight of truth he had refused to acknowledge. The baby's eyes opened fully now, dark, alert, scanning the world with a curious innocence that made Brick's chest ache in ways he had long thought impossible. He wanted to hide, to turn away, to deny what reality had imposed upon him, but his body betrayed him, rooted in place by shock, awe, and a dawning terror of responsibility he had never encountered before. Selena's laughter had stopped. Her eyes narrowed, the tension shifting subtly, as if she realized the weapon she had helped create was no longer under anyone's control. Even she seemed momentarily disarmed, watching as Bricks Moretti faced the most dangerous opponent he had ever known. Not a rival, not an enemy, but the truth itself, embodied in the woman he had left and the child he had never anticipated. Jenni took another step, deliberately shortening the distance between them, the baby secure against her chest. Each movement was deliberate, a measured assertion that she dictated the terms now. Bricks felt the full weight of it. 8 months of absence, every decision he had made to protect his power, every calculated moment of control. It had been irrelevant. She had returned with a truth that could not be contained, could not be negotiated, and could not be erased. He could hear his own heart, loud, insistent, a drumbeat of panic and realization. Words formed and dissolved before he could speak. Any attempt at explanation, justification, or claim would crumble under the undeniable evidence of her arms, her calm, her eyes, and the child who held his blood in the smallest curve of a tiny hand. The guests were frozen now, sensing the gravity of the revelation. No one spoke, no one dared. The tension was absolute, a living thing pressing against Brick's chest, a force of nature he could not fight. Every ounce of pride, every layer of armor, every strategy he had rehearsed for years dissolved under the weight of this single, undeniable fact. He had lost control. Jenni's words, soft yet deliberate, echoed again in his mind. "You disappeared." They were not just a statement. They were a verdict, a condemnation, a challenge, a reckoning. Bricks realized in that instant that every empire he had built, every act of dominance, every carefully orchestrated move could not protect him from the consequences of absence, from the consequences of a truth long denied. And in that moment, as the room seemed to close in around them and the child shifted against her chest, Bricks Moretti understood fully for the first time that power was fragile. Control was temporary, and some truths could not be negotiated or manipulated. The weapon he had thought to wield was gone. It had turned in his hands, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. 3. Bricks followed Jenni into the silent hallway, the festive illusions of Christmas fading behind him like a lie he could no longer afford to believe. The sounds of laughter, the clinking of glasses, even Selena's sharp presence felt distant, irrelevant, washed away by the gravity of what he now faced. The hall stretched before him, shadows deepening against the polished walls, each step echoing in the quiet as though marking a march toward reckoning. Brick's mind raced, trying to reconcile the woman who had once been the center of his world with the composure and strength she now exuded. She had survived, thrived, and returned not seeking confrontation, but armed with truths he had never anticipated. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was sharp, demanding, but beneath it lay desperation he could not suppress. His words hung in the air, unanswered for a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity. He already feared he knew the answer. Each beat of silence intensified the tension, echoing louder than any argument or explanation could. The air between them was charged, taut with the weight of 8 months, of absence, of unsaid words and unmet needs. Jenni's reply was steady, unflinching, yet scarred, each word carrying the weight of survival. "I tried," she said, her voice calm but layered with memory, pain, and endurance. She recounted how his calls went unanswered, how the guards and walls of his world turned her away, how the only choice she had left was survival, measured in quiet steps and careful restraint. Bricks listened, each sentence like a dagger sliding past the armor he thought impenetrable. The truth was worse than lies or betrayal. It was proof that he had failed to protect, failed to notice, and failed to act when it mattered most. The baby stirred in her arms, a delicate coo that contrasted sharply with the heavy, suffocating tension of the hallway. Jenni held him closer, steadying his tiny form with a rhythm learned through months of necessity, months in which Bricks had been absent. Bricks felt shame crawl beneath his skin, an unfamiliar sensation, a corrosive awareness of inadequacy he had not felt in years. The realization that love, real and enduring, had persisted without him, had existed, suffered, and thrived, was almost unbearable. "I loved you even when you broke me," Jenni whispered, her words barely audible but penetrating, cutting through years of indifference and miscalculations. The baby's breathing was calm, rhythmic, a silent testament to the life she had carried alone, yet Bricks realized with a pang that her peace, her strength, and her survival were no longer contingent on him. She no longer needed him, and the knowledge terrorized him more than losing power ever had. Fear was one thing, Irrelevance, impotence, and obsolescence were another entirely. Brick's hands trembled, just slightly but enough for him to notice. He had commanded armies, negotiated billion-dollar deals, silenced rivals, and yet here, in a quiet hallway, in the shadow of what he could not control, he was powerless. Every instinct screamed at him to act, to reclaim, to assert dominance, but all the usual levers failed him. She was untouchable, not through threat or strategy, but through endurance, patience, and the undeniable claim of truth. Jenni's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. They held no apology, no plea, no vulnerability intended to solicit forgiveness. Only recognition, an acknowledgement of the years that had passed, the choices that had been made, and the consequences he had refused to face. The baby shifted slightly, tiny fingers brushing against her chin, a gesture so innocent it made Brick's chest tighten further. This child was the living proof of what he had lost, what he had ignored, and what could never be reclaimed by force or will. Selena's presence was a ghost in his mind, a reminder of power, allure, and expectation. But even she could not touch the reality of this reunion. Bricks realized that control was not simply slipping. It was meaningless here. The hall seemed to contract, the walls pressing inward, emphasizing the isolation of his failure, magnifying the weight of his absence, of missed moments, of unspoken love. Each step he took toward Jenni and the baby felt like trespassing into a space already claimed, a space where he had no authority. Jenni continued, describing in measured tones how survival had become her only choice, how she had shielded herself and her child from a world that had turned cold in his absence. Bricks listened, absorbing every detail, every quiet act of endurance, every sacrifice she had made without his knowledge. It was a revelation layered with both admiration and guilt, a recognition that she had lived and loved in spite of him, not because of him. He realized painfully that his absence had not ended her story. It had merely shaped it, forged it into something more formidable, more resolute than he had ever imagined. The baby's eyes opened fully now, dark, alert, and scanning the hallway as though measuring the man who had returned to claim a place he no longer possessed. Bricks felt the weight of his own blood, his legacy, his failure, reflected in that small, fragile form. He wanted to reach out, to reclaim, to assert, but the momentum of reality pressed him back. Any action now could fracture what fragile peace she had built, and the consequences terrified him more than any rival, more than any loss of wealth or status, more than anything he had faced in his calculated life. Each word from Jenni was a layer of exposure. Each glance, each shift of the baby against her chest was a revelation of endurance he had underestimated. Bricks felt a growing panic, the kind born not of fear but of recognition, that she had survived, thrived, and built life without him, and that love, enduring and true, had persisted even in his absence. This realization was almost unbearable, the kind that leaves the chest tight, the mind racing and the soul exposed. Jenni's calm, steady voice continued, recounting nights of uncertainty, moments of danger, decisions made with care and necessity, not with resentment. Each phrase was a reminder of the reality he had ignored, the consequences he had chosen not to face, and the irreversibility of time and absence. Bricks felt the full weight of guilt, shame, and awe, all interwoven in a way that threatened to break the man he had carefully constructed over years of power and discipline. Her eyes softened slightly, and the baby shifted against her, sensing the tension, responding with the innocence of a life untouched by the political and emotional storms surrounding him. Bricks felt the raw, corrosive terror of obsolescence, realizing she no longer needed him, that his power, his presence, his identity were irrelevant to the life she now led. He had expected to assert, to command, to regain control, But there was no leverage here, only truth, only endurance, only the evidence of what he had failed to notice. The hallway seemed longer now, darker, almost infinite. Each step Bricks took toward them was measured, deliberate, yet inwardly, he was collapsing under the weight of recognition. He was an observer of what had been built without him, powerless to influence or command it. Every instinct to dominate or control faltered in the face of Jenni's unshakable calm and the baby's quiet presence. He realized that love, if it had truly endured, was no longer his to wield. It had survived, bled, and evolved without him. The baby cooed softly again, and Bricks felt a pang of longing, the kind that mixes regret with impossibility. He wanted to claim the connection, but every move was tempered by fear. Fear that any action could shatter the fragile trust Jenni had maintained. Fear that he could never undo the months of absence. Fear that the life he thought he controlled was now a reality he could not influence. The hallway became a crucible of emotion, isolation, and confrontation. Jenni's whisper, "I loved you even when you broke me," echoed in the confined space, ricocheting against the polished walls, reverberating through Brick's chest. The truth was undeniable, irreducible, unrelenting. Her love had survived everything he had done, every choice he had made, every moment he had turned away. Yet it had not awaited him. It had not bent to his will. It had endured on her terms, and that truth left him trembling, exposed, and wholly unprepared for what came next. 4. Selena lingered in the shadows, her presence a silent predator observing the fragile dynamics unfolding between Bricks and Jenni. Her smile, always precise, never reached her eyes. It was a mask honed over years of manipulation, a tool designed to conceal intent and project loyalty while harboring ambition. She had studied him with meticulous patience, noting every hesitation, every moment of weakness, every trace of emotion that slipped past his controlled exterior. Tonight, as she watched the man she claimed to love grapple with truths he had ignored for months, her satisfaction was quiet, deadly, and absolute. Bricks, still reeling from the confrontation with Jenni and the undeniable reality of his son, returned to his private study later that night. The mansion was eerily silent, Christmas lights dim against the darkness that now mirrored his inner turmoil. His phone buzzed with a report he had not anticipated, a document that promised not closure but devastation. Every line of text, every encrypted message, every financial irregularity coalesced into a single revelation: betrayal. His pulse quickened, chest tightening as he scrolled with disbelief, the weight of the discovery threatening to buckle his legs. Secret accounts, hidden transfers, encrypted calls, clandestine movements revealed in painstaking detail. Every line pointed to one conclusion. The traitor's name burned like acid across the page: Selena. His mind recoiled, simultaneously refusing to believe and forced to acknowledge the truth. Every calculation, every strategy, every measure of trust he had placed in her had been weaponized against him. Selena had not loved him. She had studied him. She had waited, patient and predatory, until she could leverage his emotional distance to her advantage, learning when to advance, when to retreat, and when to strike. The mansion seemed suddenly smaller, oppressive, claustrophobic, as the enormity of betrayal settled over Bricks like a physical weight. Every wall, every corridor, every luxurious detail he had built to assert control now seemed irrelevant, fragile, temporary. The reality was undeniable. While he had been struggling to reclaim a past he had abandoned, she had been orchestrating a war from within his closest circles, embedding spies, monitoring communications, and undermining alliances. His heart, which had begun to thaw in Jenni's presence, now hardened with ice-cold rage. Brick's eyes narrowed as he absorbed every detail of the report: calls to his lieutenants, movements of funds, whispers in the underworld, Selena had been everywhere and nowhere, a phantom weaving betrayal into the very fabric of his empire. Each revelation ignited fury within him, yet his fury was deliberate, controlled, colder than fire. He did not scream, did not rage blindly. Instead, he calculated, reorganized, and prepared. The war he had fought so meticulously for power and dominance now required a new target. The woman who had pretended to love him while undermining everything he had built. He summoned his most trusted enforcers, men whose loyalty had been tested in blood and fire. The order was precise, silent, absolute. Selena was to be detained immediately, removed from the mansion quietly, before her manipulations could extend further. Every step was executed with surgical precision. Brick's voice, when he issued the commands, was calm, devoid of tremor, yet every syllable carried the weight of imminent retribution. She had played a dangerous game, and he would end it with the efficiency that had defined his life. Selena realized too late that the balance had shifted. Her eyes widened in shock, lips parting in a silent scream that quickly erupted into a raw, piercing sound. The echo of her betrayal, her surprise, her fury, and her fear ricocheted through the mansion. But Bricks did not listen. He did not falter. He watched her struggle only to confirm the success of his command. Her power, once intoxicating, had crumbled in the face of meticulous planning, loyalty from his enforcers, and his own cold resolve. She had been untouchable in her manipulation, until now. Yet even as Selena's cries faded, Brick's mind did not rest. The war had changed, and so had its stakes. He no longer sought dominance for pride or territory. This was personal, intimate, and unforgiving. Betrayal by someone so close had shifted the battlefield from the external world to the core of his own life, forcing him to reassess every relationship, every alliance, every vulnerability he had ever exposed. Trust was no longer a luxury. It was a weapon he could not afford to wield blindly. The mansion felt alien now, shadows longer, corners sharper, every room a reminder of the deception that had existed under the guise of affection. Bricks moved through the halls like a man born anew, every step deliberate, eyes scanning, ears alert, mind calculating. He knew that Jenni's return had disrupted more than just his emotions. It had revealed cracks in his empire that could have been fatal. Selena's betrayal was proof that even the closest allies could become enemies if underestimated. He paused outside Jenni's door, hearing the soft, rhythmic breathing of their son, and realized that his priorities had irrevocably shifted. The stakes were no longer just power, money, or reputation. They were protection, family, and the restoration of order in a life that had been deliberately fractured by ambition and deceit. Selena's betrayal, while significant, had exposed vulnerabilities that demanded immediate, uncompromising attention. Brick's strategy evolved on the spot, recalibrating to address both internal threats and external opportunities. Each passing second reinforced the urgency. He could not afford hesitation, compromise, or misjudgment. Selena had been clever, but she had underestimated the full extent of his precision, patience, and cold resolve. Every loyal operative, every hidden camera, every encrypted line of communication became a tool in his reclamation, an arsenal of intelligence to neutralize the woman who had once been a partner in his life, and was now the target of his retribution. The echo of Selena's scream lingered in his mind, but Bricks focused on what truly mattered. Jenni, the baby, the fragile yet unassailable life she had built in his absence. These were no longer details to be ignored or mismanaged. They were central to his new calculus, guiding every decision with clarity, ferocity, and singular purpose. The war had changed, indeed, but he was no longer fighting for domination alone. He was fighting for rectification, justice, and reclamation of the life that had been threatened by deceit. Bricks knew the night was far from over. Selena's treachery had been revealed, but the ripple effects were only beginning. Rivals would sense vulnerability. Allies might falter. Every decision, every move, every whisper now carried consequences exponentially more severe. He could feel the momentum building, the tension coiling like a spring, ready to release in controlled chaos. And as he prepared for the next phase of action, he understood fully that nothing and no one could survive unscathed in the wake of his calculated fury. 5. Brix entered the nursery like a man crossing the threshold into sacred, uncharted territory. The air was thick with the faint scent of baby powder and warmth, a stark contrast to the cold corridors of power he had navigated all his life. Every detail of the room was deliberately soft, unassuming yet precise, the way Jenni had built a sanctuary, a world separate from his empire, yet tethered to his blood. The walls, painted in muted tones, reflected a quiet protection, and the crib, sturdy and immaculately arranged, sat like an altar at the center. Brix's footsteps were heavy with anticipation, yet each one measured, as if the floor itself might betray him to some unseen danger. Jenni stood beside the crib, her presence radiating both exhaustion and unwavering strength. Dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and constant vigilance, yet her posture remained perfect, shoulders squared, gaze sharp. She had carried this child, defended him, protected him from a world he could not yet understand, and now she had brought him here, into his hands. The quiet gravity of the moment pressed on Brix with a weight heavier than any negotiation, any battle, any empire he had ever controlled. Without hesitation, without a word of explanation, she lifted the baby and placed him gently in his arms. The instant contact shattered something within Brix, a force more powerful than rage, than dominance, than any weapon he had ever wielded. The baby's warmth seeped into his chest, tiny fingers curling instinctively around his thumb, a trust so absolute it demanded awe and fear in equal measure. Brix froze for a heartbeat, the weight of responsibility crashing into him like a tidal wave. Every calculation he had made, every empire, every controlled breath, it all collapsed under the undeniable reality of new life entrusted to him. The child settled against him instantly, as if recognizing the protection in his presence. There was no fear, no hesitation, only the instinctive security of a soul untainted by the world's cruelty. Brix felt his chest tighten with a combination of awe, terror, and something he had long refused to acknowledge: unconditional love. His own life, his ego, his relentless pursuit of power, all of it seemed trivial in comparison to the fragile, perfect being cradled against his heart. The weight in his arms was more than physical. It was destiny, responsibility, and redemption wrapped into one. "I'll destroy anything that threatens him," Brix vowed quietly, voice low but resonant with lethal certainty. The words were not for Jenni. They were for the world, for anyone foolish enough to underestimate the stakes, for the enemies gathering just beyond the walls of this sanctuary. His fingers tightened slightly, the baby stirring but remaining calm, as if sensing the promise in that vow. Every ounce of Brix Moretti, the man who had commanded armies, negotiated billion-dollar deals, and navigated life-and-death power plays, now existed solely to protect this fragile life. Jenni's eyes studied him with unwavering precision. She did not look for promises or empty assurances. She sought proof, evidence of the man capable of sustaining this devotion without hesitation, without faltering. Her gaze was sharp, almost clinical, piercing through the layers of his pride and dominance to reach the raw, unguarded core of who he was. Brix met her eyes, understanding in a single instant the cost of failure, the impossibility of half-hearted protection, and the irrevocable shift in his priorities. "You don't get to love halfway anymore," she warned softly, her words simple yet monumental, a contract inked in trust, vigilance, and the shared reality of their son. Brix nodded, every nerve in his body acknowledging the weight of her truth. There would be no compromise, no selective devotion, no self-serving protection. Every decision, every action, every breath from this moment on would be measured against the life in his arms, the embodiment of consequence, responsibility, and enduring love. The baby stirred again, tiny arms reaching upward, the movement instinctive and trusting, and Brix adjusted his hold instinctively, feeling the fragility of life in a way that power and fear had never prepared him for. Each heartbeat resonated against his chest like a drumbeat, syncing with his own, a rhythm of connection, a tether that anchored him in a reality far removed from the empires, rivalries, and betrayals he had known. He was not just a man of influence, he was a father. Outside the nursery, the world remained dangerous and unpredictable. Enemies moved in shadows, watching, calculating, sensing opportunities in weakness. Brix could feel it, the subtle shift in tension, the unspoken awareness of adversaries gathering quietly, waiting to exploit any vulnerability. But inside, in the cocoon of the nursery, his presence was absolute, his protection uncompromising. Nothing would reach this child unless Brix permitted it, and he would permit nothing. He traced the delicate lines of the baby's face with a trembling finger, memorizing every curve, every hint of resemblance, every fragile perfection. This was his blood, his legacy, and yet also a being wholly separate, dependent and trusting. He felt the raw power of paternal responsibility surge through him, a force that dwarfed any ambition, any scheme, any empire he had ever known. The nursery became sacred ground, a battlefield where his devotion would be tested, yet also the only space where vulnerability and strength existed in perfect balance. Jenni remained silent but alert, her gaze constantly scanning him, the child, and the room. She did not need to speak. Her vigilance was proof of what had been endured and what would be demanded in the days to come. Brix understood then that the stakes had shifted irreversibly. The wars he had fought in the outside world were trivial compared to the protection, guidance, and vigilance now required of him. Every instinct, every skill he had honed for control, for dominance, for survival, would now be measured against the safety and flourishing of the small life in his arms. Brix adjusted his stance, feeling the infant shift slightly against his chest, tiny limbs pressing into him with delicate insistence. A sharp clarity hit him. This was no longer a life he could protect from the sidelines. Every step, every breath, every moment of thought from this point forward would revolve around safeguarding the child. Love was no longer optional. Commitment was absolute. Sacrifice was immediate. And the man who had once measured power in fear and obedience now measured himself in devotion, responsibility, and the quiet, terrifying weight of fatherhood. He leaned slightly closer, his forehead brushing against the baby's soft hair, inhaling the innocence and fragility in a single, concentrated breath. Each exhale carried a promise, a vow that no threat, internal or external, would ever reach this child without facing him first. He was a king, yes, but kings fell. He was a leader, yes, but leaders could be undermined. Here, in this small, dimly lit room, he discovered the first truth that surpassed all others. A father's resolve was absolute, unyielding, and eternal. The baby yawned, stretching tiny limbs instinctively, and Brix felt a jolt of awe and terror simultaneously. Such perfection was fragile, fleeting, and yet wholly dependent on him. One misstep, one moment of inattention, one failure, and everything he now held sacred could be destroyed. The weight of that possibility pressed against him, sharpening his focus, fortifying his resolve. Every breath, every heartbeat, every second became a pledge of protection, an oath written in instinct, love, and fierce determination. Jenni's expression softened just slightly, just enough to reveal the recognition that the man before her had changed. He was no longer just Brix Moretti, master of empires and executor of power. He was a man reborn, tethered irrevocably to the life cradled in his arms. She did not offer praise or approval. She only observed, silently confirming that the responsibility he now carried was understood and embraced fully. The weight of that understanding was monumental. Outside, enemies shifted in the shadows, waiting for weakness, for distraction, for hesitation. But inside, in the quiet light of the nursery, Brix's resolve hardened into something immutable. He would destroy any threat. He would endure every challenge. He would wield his power, his intelligence, his ferocity, not for dominance over others, but to protect the life entrusted to him. Every calculation, every plan, every ounce of experience now had a singular purpose. The baby stirred again, tiny eyes blinking open to reveal a gaze that mirrored his own. Brix's chest tightened with an awareness he could not articulate. This life was his, yet independent, fragile, yet demanding, trusting, yet untested by the world's cruelty. He understood profoundly that love alone would not suffice. Vigilance, patience, courage, and ferocity were required in equal measure, and he would provide it. Jenni's warning lingered in his mind. You don't get to love halfway anymore. Every word resonated, a compass guiding the man he had once been toward the father he was becoming. The cost of failure was immediate, unforgiving, and irrevocable. Brix Moretti, for the first time in his life, felt the full weight of consequences he could not negotiate, evade, or manipulate. He was no longer merely a man of power. He was a guardian, a protector, a father. 6. Brix moved through the shadows of his empire with a purpose he had never known before. The cold, precise strategies that had built his dominance in the underworld now collided with a different priority: the safety of the child in his arms. Each alliance he had once nurtured for leverage, each partnership maintained for influence, now came under scrutiny. He dismantled connections that had been forged in blood, calculated not for profit or power, but for survival of something infinitely more precious. Territory and respect mattered less than the fragile life at the center of his world. Whispers in the underworld began to circulate immediately. Competitors sensed a shift, reading hesitation in the moves of a man they had once feared above all. Rumors spread like wildfire. Brix Moretti was weakening, softening, prioritizing safety over supremacy. Yet what they could not see, what they could not understand, was that the real strength lay not in dominance, but in restraint. Every step he took to protect his family was calculated, deliberate, and deadly in its own right. This was a power no rival could touch, because it was born of love and fear combined. Jenni watched carefully, guarding her heart as she had for months. She had learned to measure his actions against his words, to wait for proof rather than promise, to evaluate him on the smallest gestures. She observed his late-night walks through the mansion, the way he lingered by the nursery door, how his hand unconsciously rested on the doorknob, as if bracing for the worst. She did not rush him, did not speak, but every small observation strengthened her understanding of the man he was becoming. She had survived his absence, but now, witnessing his transformation, she wondered if survival alone would be enough to trust again. One night she found him asleep beside the crib, the soft glow of a nightlight reflecting off his tense features. His hand rested instinctively over the small body of their son, protective, unwavering. Even in slumber, his vigilance was absolute. Jenni's heart constricted at the sight. The man who had once demanded fear and obedience now exuded a quiet, relentless devotion. There was no posturing, no performance, only the raw presence of a father wholly committed to safeguarding what mattered most. "You're changing," she whispered softly, barely moving, afraid to break the fragile moment. Her voice floated across the room, tentative, a bridge across months of mistrust and distance. Brick's eyes fluttered open slowly, and for the first time in months, he met her gaze with something more than command or calculation. He met it with acknowledgement, guilt, and unspoken apology. His voice was low, rough with exhaustion, yet each word carried conviction. "I already lost you once," he replied, the weight of the past etched into every syllable. The silence that followed was heavy, dense with memory, with regret, with everything neither of them had said for months. It was not an easy silence. It was the kind that reminded them both of what had been lost and what now needed to be reclaimed. Jenni moved closer, seating herself beside him on the floor, her presence cautious, yet tethered by hope she could not entirely resist. Forgiveness hovered, fragile, tentative, but it had not yet landed. They both understood the precarious balance between reconciliation and retreat. Bricks adjusted slightly, careful not to disturb the child, yet fully aware of Jenni's proximity. The act of sharing space, of existing in the same moment without conflict, was revolutionary for him. In his world, proximity often meant negotiation, tension, or calculation. Now, it simply meant presence, and that was both terrifying and transformative. His fingers brushed against hers briefly, a tentative acknowledgement, and Jenni's heart reacted before her mind could catch up. Days blurred into nights as Bricks recalibrated every part of his life. His empire, once maintained through fear and ruthlessness, now demanded a different form of command. He chose battles strategically, avoided unnecessary violence, and ensured that his moves were informed by both protection and loyalty, rather than ego alone. The underworld murmured, questioning his motives, testing boundaries. Yet every test was met not with arrogance, but with precision, a lethal efficiency designed to safeguard what mattered most. Jenni observed silently, her heart caught between relief and skepticism. She had seen power, ambition, and ruthlessness before, but never this transformation. She witnessed him reviewing intelligence late into the night, cross-referencing threats, assessing every possible risk. And yet there was patience in his approach, a focus not on conquest, but on securing a future for the child, for them, for something larger than blood or territory. One evening, Bricks returned from a meeting with his most trusted lieutenants, the weight of unseen eyes upon him. He moved through the mansion with a deliberate slowness, scanning shadows, listening for whispers. Enemies had already begun to sense opportunity. Competitors thought his devotion made him weak, unaware that the fiercest storms often come cloaked in serenity. He paused outside the nursery, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his son, a grounding force that reminded him of what truly mattered. Jenni approached quietly, her hand brushing against his arm. He did not flinch. Instead, he adjusted instinctively, his attention split but unwavering. "You're not the same man," she said, her voice soft but observant. There was no accusation, no judgment, only recognition. Bricks allowed himself the smallest acknowledgement, a nod, a fleeting smile that was unpracticed, real. That simple gesture carried more weight than any victory he had ever achieved in the streets or boardrooms. He knelt beside the crib, observing their son asleep, tiny fingers curling with instinctive security. Every protective instinct, honed through a lifetime of danger and calculation, now converged into a singular purpose: the preservation of life, love, and family. Bricks realized that strength was not measured by fear or dominance, but by sacrifice, vigilance, and the willingness to put another's safety above one's own pride. The nights grew quieter, the mansion softer, yet threats never ceased. Competitors tested boundaries, spies infiltrated, whispers reached ears that should not have heard them. Bricks countered each threat with precision, the fire of retribution tempered by purpose. His reputation shifted silently, respected, feared, but differently now. Power was no longer raw or indiscriminate. It was strategic, protective, and intimately personal. Jenni watched him through it all, torn between fear of the old bricks and hope for the new. She saw the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the way he moved through danger, as if anticipating every move. She felt the transformation not only in strategy, but in the subtle touches. The way he paused to ensure she and the child were safe, the quiet acknowledgement of responsibility he once would have ignored. One morning, she found him seated by the window, staring into the distance, the baby cradled in one arm, his other hand resting gently on her shoulder. Words were unnecessary. The silence conveyed a shared understanding. The world was dangerous, yet here, in this moment, the choice had been made. Family over power, love over dominance, protection over empire. The enormity of that choice pressed on them both, unspoken but absolute. The nights that followed were punctuated by quiet tension. Every creak of the mansion, every subtle shift of shadow, every faint noise outside the nursery reminded Bricks of the fragility of life and the cost of failure. Yet each sound was met with calculated vigilance, every instinct sharpened by love, fear, and the unyielding knowledge that failure was no longer an option. Jenni sat beside him during these nights, observing, cautious yet tethered by hope. Forgiveness hovered in the air, intangible, delicate, yet persistent. She did not speak, knowing that words could break the fragile equilibrium. Instead, she allowed herself to witness, to measure, to understand that Brick's transformation was neither fleeting nor performative. It was genuine, rooted in responsibility, fear, love, and the primal instinct to protect what was his. Bricks rested a moment, gazing down at their son's peaceful face. The city outside, the empire, the threats, the whispers, all of it faded into insignificance. Here in the nursery, he was not a king or a crime lord. He was a father, a guardian, a man reborn through love and responsibility. Every night reinforced the lesson he had never learned in power alone. Some victories were measured not in fear or conquest, but in the safety, happiness, and survival of those who depended on you most. Christmas morning arrived in silence, a stark contrast to the cacophony of past years. The mansion, once alive with orchestrated laughter, clinking glasses, and the carefully curated warmth of celebration, now breathed quietly. The snow outside fell thick and undisturbed, muffling the world and creating a sense of isolation that was intimate, almost sacred. Brick stood near the large window, watching the white expanse stretch beyond the gates, feeling a heaviness in his chest that was both unfamiliar and undeniable. He had faced enemies, betrayals, and death, but nothing had carried the weight of this day, the day he would confront himself fully. Jenni appeared in the doorway of the nursery, soft light spilling around her like a halo. She held their son in her arms, the baby still swaddled, eyes blinking sleepily in the dawn. There was no urgency, no demand, only the quiet assurance that everything had changed. Brick's chest tightened, muscles coiling with emotion he had long denied, as he took in the sight of the two lives he now understood were the only stakes that truly mattered. The empire, the power, the respect. They were all irrelevant in this room, in this moment. He stepped forward, hesitant yet deliberate, each footfall echoing against polished floors that had once mirrored ambition, greed, and dominance. Pride, once the shield he wielded against all vulnerability, had been stripped away through months of struggle, revelation, and responsibility. Standing before Jenni, he saw clearly the man he had been, the man who walked away, who chose power over love, who let absence define his actions. And he saw, with terrifying clarity, the man he must now become: protector, father, and partner. "I don't deserve you," Brick said quietly, each word measured yet raw, stripped of pretense. His voice trembled slightly, a subtle betrayal of the torrent of emotion beneath, but it held weight, honesty, and conviction. "But I will become someone who protects what he loves." It was not a promise of perfection, but a vow of effort, vigilance, and unwavering commitment. Jenni looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, then softened as her gaze shifted to their son. The baby cooed softly, tiny fingers curling instinctively, anchoring them both in the immediacy of life and love. Love, Jenni understood, was not forgetting. It was not erasing wounds or pretending absence had not existed. It was a choice, made again and again, despite fear, pain, and memory. She placed their son into Brick's arms slowly, deliberately, ensuring that the first connection was deliberate, tender, and unbroken. The baby rested easily against him, trusting instinctively, a silent acknowledgement that some bonds transcended betrayal, absence, and fear. Brick's chest expanded, the physical weight mirrored by the emotional gravity pressing upon him. He lifted the child carefully, the responsibility overwhelming yet clarifying. Every detail of the baby's small face, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the fragile weight in Brick's arms, hammered home the reality he could no longer ignore. This life, these lives, were now his central purpose. The empire outside, the whispers in the underworld, even Selena's betrayal, all of it paled against the immediacy of the bond he now bore. His hands, which had once delivered orders and executed enemies without hesitation, now cradled life with reverent precision. Jenni sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from Brick's, but distant enough to maintain caution. Forgiveness lingered in the air like a fragile fragrance, almost tangible, yet unclaimed. She allowed herself to witness the transformation, measuring intent by gestures, by the careful movements of a man who had once been capable of destruction, but now existed entirely in service of protection. Bricks caught her gaze briefly, a silent acknowledgement that the past had been faced, and the present demanded presence, responsibility, and choice. The snow outside continued to fall, thick and unrelenting, covering the world in white silence. Bells rang faintly in the distance, carried by the wind, marking the day with a resonance that echoed through the mansion and Brick's chest. Each note was a reminder of impermanence, of fragility, and yet of hope, a rare combination he had long thought incompatible with his world. Yet here, in the quiet, the soft illumination of dawn, the world seemed to pause, allowing a moment of reconciliation between past mistakes and future responsibility. Bricks adjusted slightly, ensuring the baby's comfort, every motion deliberate, unhurried. He traced the small, perfect lines of the child's face with awe, memorizing each detail as if engraving it onto his very soul. This life was fragile, irreplaceable, and yet resilient, like the woman beside him who had survived absence, betrayal, and hardship. He understood finally that power could never protect them. Only vigilance, love, and deliberate choice could, and he was prepared to wield them ruthlessly, without hesitation, without compromise. "Then we start carefully," Jenni whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying monumental weight. The words were a covenant, a starting point, a shared acknowledgement of the fragility and necessity of trust rebuilt. Bricks nodded, absorbing the gravity, the responsibility, and the unspoken conditions inherent in her words. They would move forward slowly, deliberately, understanding that even the smallest misstep could unravel everything they were beginning to rebuild. The mansion, once alive with calculated light, now felt quiet, warm, and alive in a different sense. Every shadow was softened by the glow of candlelight and sunrise. every echo of the past muted by the gentle breathing of a child cradled safely in arms, once accustomed only to wielding power. Brix allowed himself to breathe, the first unguarded breath in months, feeling the weight of responsibility settle fully upon him, not as burden, but as purpose, unshakable and necessary. Outside, the underworld moved, unaware of the transformation occurring within these walls. Rivals tested boundaries, evaluated weakness, assumed distraction. But Brix's priorities had irrevocably shifted. He would meet every threat with vigilance, every challenge with precision, every potential betrayal with relentless clarity. His empire remained, but it was now secondary. The first priority, the only priority, was life, love, and family. Jenni watched him silently, noting the subtle changes, the way his shoulders relaxed when he held their son, the softening in his eyes, the unspoken promises in every measured movement. She allowed herself to hope, yet tempered the hope with realism, understanding that the past could not be erased, but could serve as guidance for the future. Forgiveness, she knew, was a process. Trust, even more so. But the foundation had been laid today in quiet dignity, in deliberate choice, in mutual recognition of what truly mattered. Brix bent slightly, pressing his forehead to the baby's soft hair, inhaling the scent, memorizing the texture, the warmth, the essence of life he had never truly understood before. Every lesson he had learned in power, betrayal, and control now served a new purpose, safeguarding the fragility, nurturing the strength, and guiding the life entrusted to him. The empire, the enemies, the world outside, none of it mattered more than this single, unassailable truth. The bells rang again, louder this time, echoing through the snow-covered streets, through the mansion, through the quiet heartbeat of new beginnings. Brix Moretti, once a man who measured his life by fear and dominance, now bowed only to the unyielding, uncontrollable force of love. He held his son with unwavering intent, feeling both vulnerability and strength in equal measure. Outside, the snow swirled, blanketing the world in silence. Inside, a family began anew. The morning sun filtered through frost-lined windows, casting delicate light across the nursery. Brix shifted, careful to maintain the baby's comfort, yet every movement was deliberate, full of conscious choice. He understood fully that every day ahead would be a test, not of power, but of vigilance, devotion, and the ability to act selflessly in the face of everything he once valued above life itself. The weight in his arms was mirrored by the weight in his heart, grounding him, defining him, transforming him. Jenni leaned against him slightly, a gesture of trust, yet measured, aware that reconciliation was gradual. Her eyes met his with quiet acknowledgement. He had fought, he had returned, and he had chosen. The past, with all its scars, its pain, and its betrayals, could not undo the deliberate choice being made now. Love, when chosen fully, was the only power absolute. And for the first time, Brix Moretti understood that he could not control it, but he could honor it, defend it, and allow it to define the man he would be from this day forward. The snow fell steadily, bells tolled, and inside the nursery, a quiet miracle unfolded. A father held his son, a mother allowed herself to hope, and a family fractured by absence and betrayal began to rewrite its fate, one careful, deliberate moment at a time. Brix's eyes softened as he looked at Jenni and their child, finally accepting that power lost mattered nothing compared to love chosen. And in that realization, a lifetime of mistakes found redemption, not through force, but through the courage to protect what truly mattered. Wow, what a story. If this emotional journey moved you, make sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear which part touched you the most. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new tale from Heart-Woven Tales. Remember, every story here is crafted to touch your heart, so stay with us for more unforgettable journeys. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.